My family used my college fund to pay for my sister's wedding. You can always take out loans, they shrugged. For years later, they need my help, and I gave them the same answer. I, 22 discovered my entire college fund had vanished on a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 3 weeks before my final semester payment was due. The email from the bank was clinical in its brevity. Insufficient funds to cover the automatic transfer to my university. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stared at the screen, convinced there had been some mistake. The joint savings account that had been steadily growing since I was 5 years old showed a balance of $247.83. For years of my life, countless birthday checks from grandparents, summer job earnings, and my parents' monthly contributions, all of it gone. $68,000 had simply evaporated. My hands shook as I called the bank. The representative confirmed what I already knew, but refused to accept. 3 large withdrawals over the past month had drained the account, all authorized by my father, who was the primary account holder. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing through possibilities. Maybe Dad had moved the money to a better investment account. Maybe there was some financial emergency I didn't know about. The familiar suburban street looked different somehow, like I was seeing it through someone else's eyes. Mom was in the kitchen arranging white roses in crystal vases when I walked in. The entire house smelled like flowers, and there were wedding magazines scattered across the dining room table. My sister's engagement photos smiled up at me from glossy pages. I asked Mom about the account as calmly as I could manage. She looked up from the roses, her face flushing pink before she even spoke. She said they needed to talk, but Dad wasn't home from work yet. The way she avoided my eyes told me everything I needed to know. When Dad finally walked through the front door at 6:30, I was waiting in the living room. Mom had already filled him in. I could tell by the defensive set of his shoulders and the way he loosened his tie like he was preparing for battle. He sat down heavily in his recliner and told me they had used the money for my sister's wedding. Just like that, no preamble, no apology. The wedding was in 6 weeks, and the venue had demanded full payment up front. They had already put down deposits they couldn't get back, and my sister's fiancé's family was covering the rehearsal dinner and honeymoon. I asked him if he was serious. $68,000 for a wedding. Dad's jaw tightened, and he told me it wasn't just any wedding. It was his daughter's dream wedding. My sister had been planning this since she was 12, he said. They couldn't let her down. I reminded him that I was also his child, that this was my education we were talking about. Dad waved his hand dismissively and said I was young, I was smart, I could figure it out. Student loans existed for a reason. I could always take out loans, he said with a shrug that made my vision blur with rage. Mom finally spoke up, her voice small and conciliatory. She said they would pay me back after the wedding, once things settled down. They were just borrowing it, she insisted. It wasn't like they were stealing from me. But I knew better. Dad had been complaining about money for months. His construction business was struggling, and Mom's part-time job at the dentist's office barely covered groceries. They had no way to pay me back, and we all knew it. My sister came home that evening glowing from her final dress fitting. She found me in my room, staring at my laptop screen where my university's payment portal showed an overdue balance. She perched on my desk chair and told me how perfect everything was going to be, how the venue looked like something from a fairy tale. I told her about the college fund. Her face went through a series of expressions: surprise, guilt, defensiveness, and finally indignation. She said she hadn't known about the specifics, but she wasn't going to apologize for having the wedding she'd always dreamed of. I was her brother, she said. Shouldn't I want her to be happy? I asked her if she wanted me to drop out of college for her happiness. She got quiet then, her fingers twisting her engagement ring. She said I was being dramatic. 1 semester wouldn't kill me. I could take a gap year, work, save up, and go back. People did it all the time. The next morning, I went to the financial aid office at my university. The counselor was sympathetic but realistic. It was too late in the semester for most aid programs, and my family's income level meant I wouldn't qualify for need-based assistance anyway. She handed me a stack of private loan applications and wished me luck. I spent the next week filling out paperwork and getting rejected by lenders. My credit history was non-existent, and without a cosigner, no bank wanted to touch me. When I asked Dad to co-sign, he said he couldn't risk his credit on student loans when his business was already stretched thin. 3 days before the wedding, I made the call I'd been dreading. I withdrew from my final semester, 2 months before graduation. For years of work, and I was leaving with nothing but debt from my previous semesters and a bitter taste in my mouth. The wedding was everything my sister had dreamed of. Ice sculptures and string quartets, designer flowers, and a 7-course dinner. I watched my parents beam with pride as she walked down the aisle in a dress that cost more than most people's cars. The photographer captured every moment of her perfect day while I stood in the back, calculating how much money was disappearing with each champagne toast. After the honeymoon, I tried talking to my parents again about paying me back. Dad said the wedding had cost more than expected, and they needed time to recover financially. Mom suggested I move back home to save money while I figured things out. They acted like they'd done me a favor, like I should be grateful for the opportunity to reassess my priorities. Instead, I moved out. I found a studio apartment across town and took 2 jobs, morning shifts at a warehouse and evening shifts at a restaurant. I was determined to save enough money to go back to school, and I was equally determined to do it without their help. It took me 2 years to save enough for my final semester, and another year to actually complete it. I graduated at 25, 3 years behind schedule, with a degree that should have been the foundation of my future, but felt more like a monument to my family's betrayal. I didn't invite them to my graduation. When Mom called crying about how hurt she was to miss such an important milestone, I told her she'd made her choice 3 years earlier. Important milestones apparently only mattered when they were photographed in white dresses. I threw myself into my career with the single-minded focus of someone who had something to prove. The marketing firm that hired me recognized my drive immediately, and I climbed the ladder faster than anyone expected. I worked weekends, took on extra projects, and networked like my life depended on it. By the time I turned 28, I was making more money than my father ever had. I bought a house in the city, started investing, and built the life I'd always planned to have, just 3 years later than scheduled. The bitterness hadn't faded, but it had crystallized into something harder and more useful: motivation. My relationship with my family during those years was cordial but distant. I showed up for major holidays and made polite conversation, but the easy closeness we'd once shared was gone. My sister had 2 kids and seemed genuinely happy in her suburban life. My parents had aged noticeably, the financial stress of the wedding and its aftermath etched in the lines around their eyes. Dad's construction business never recovered from the economic downturn that hit right after the wedding. He'd taken on too much debt trying to expand, and when the housing market crashed, he lost 3 major contracts in a single month. Mom had to quit her part-time job to help with the business, but even working together, they could barely keep their heads above water. I heard about their problems through family friends and distant relatives, never directly from them. Pride, apparently, was hereditary in our family. Update 1. The call came on a rainy Thursday evening in November, 4 years and 8 months after my sister's wedding. I was reviewing quarterly reports in my home office when my phone buzzed with Dad's contact information. We hadn't spoken directly in 6 months. His voice sounded older, strained in a way that immediately put me on alert. He asked if I had time to talk, and something in his tone made me close my laptop and give him my full attention. The business was failing, he told me. Not struggling, failing. They owed money to suppliers, contractors, and the bank that had financed their equipment. The house, which they'd used as collateral for a business loan 2 years earlier, was now at risk. They had 30 days to come up with $45,000, or they'd lose everything. I listened in silence as he explained how they'd tried everything: borrowed against Mom's retirement account, sold their second car, even pawned Mom's wedding ring. My sister and her husband had helped what they could, but they had their own mortgage and 2 small children to think about. Dad's voice cracked when he asked if I could help them. Not a gift, he insisted. A loan with interest, a proper business arrangement. He'd put together a payment plan, he said. They could have the money back to me within 2 years. I sat in my leather chair, looking out at the city lights through my floor-to-ceiling windows, and felt absolutely nothing. No satisfaction, no anger, no sympathy. Just a cold, empty clarity that surprised me with its intensity. I asked him if he remembered what he'd told me 4 years earlier when I needed help with school. There was silence on the other end of the line, then a quiet admission that he did. I told him he could always take out loans. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Dad tried to explain that this was different, that they'd already maxed out their credit trying to save the business. Banks wouldn't touch them anymore, and private lenders were asking for terms they couldn't possibly meet. They'd worked their whole lives to build something, and now they were watching it crumble. I reminded him that I'd worked my whole life toward my education, toward a future that they'd sacrificed without consultation. I told him about the 2 jobs, the studio apartment, the 3-year delay in starting my career. I explained how their decision had affected not just my timeline, but my entire trajectory. He was quiet for a long moment before admitting that maybe they'd made a mistake. Maybe they should have found another way to pay for the wedding. But what was done, he said. Couldn't we move forward? Couldn't I find it in my heart to help family? I told him that family was supposed to help each other, not sacrifice one child's future for another's party. I told him I'd learned that lesson 4 years too late, but I'd learned it well. The conversation ended with Dad asking me to think about it, to sleep on it before making a final decision. He said he'd call back in a few days, after I'd had time to consider what losing their home would mean for the family. I didn't need time to think. I'd had 4 years to think. Update 2. My sister called the next morning. Her voice was tight with tears and barely controlled anger. She accused me of being cruel, of holding a grudge over something that was ancient history. She said Mom had been crying all night, and Dad hadn't spoken to anyone since our phone call. She reminded me that they were family, that family forgave and moved forward. She talked about how hard the past few years had been for our parents, how they'd already lost so much. She begged me to reconsider, to find some compassion in my heart for the people who raised me. I listened to her entire speech before responding. Then I asked her about her wedding fund. The question caught her off guard. She stammered that she didn't understand what I meant. They'd spent everything on the wedding, she said. There was no fund left. I clarified. I asked about the fund she and her husband were building for their own children's weddings. She was quiet for a moment before admitting that yes, they'd started saving for their daughter's future weddings. It wasn't much yet, but they wanted their girls to have beautiful celebrations when the time came. I asked her how much they'd saved so far. Reluctantly, she told me it was about $12,000. Not nearly enough for what weddings cost these days, she added defensively. I suggested she use that money to help our parents. After all, it was just a wedding fund. Her daughters could always take out loans for their celebrations. The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, she said it wasn't the same thing. That was her children's future I was talking about, something she and her husband had worked hard to build. I couldn't possibly expect them to sacrifice their daughter's dreams for this crisis. I told her she was absolutely right. She couldn't possibly sacrifice her children's future for someone else's emergency. It was good that she understood that principle so clearly. She hung up on me. Mom called that afternoon. Her voice was small and broken in a way that might have moved me for years earlier. She talked about how disappointed she was in the person I'd become, how I'd let money turn me cold and selfish. She said she never raised me to abandon family in their darkest hour. I reminded her that she'd raised me to believe family came first, right up until they needed something from me. Then I'd learned that family came second to wedding venues and flower arrangements. She started crying then, telling me about the sleepless nights and the phone calls from creditors. She described how Dad stared at his tools every morning like he was saying goodbye to old friends. She painted a picture of 2 people who'd worked their whole lives watching everything slip away. I told her I was sorry they were going through such a difficult time. I genuinely meant it. But I also told her that their emergency didn't constitute a claim on my bank account, any more than my educational emergency had constituted a claim on my college fund. She asked me what it would take for me to forgive them. What could they do to make this right? I told her there was nothing to forgive. They'd made their choice based on their priorities, and I was making mine based on mine. This wasn't about forgiveness. It was about consequences. Update 3. The call stopped after that, but the messages didn't. I received texts from aunts and uncles, family friends, even my high school math teacher who somehow got involved in the drama. Everyone had an opinion about my heartlessness, my selfishness, my failure to understand what family meant. Some of the messages were angry, calling me names and questioning my character. Others were manipulative, describing in detail how my parents were suffering and how I had the power to end their pain. A few were bargaining, promising that this time would be different, that they'd learned their lesson and would never prioritize one child over another again. I blocked most of the numbers and ignored the rest. Social media became a minefield of passive-aggressive posts about ungrateful children and the importance of family loyalty. I deactivated my accounts and focused on work. 3 weeks after Dad's initial call, I received a certified letter from their attorney. My parents were officially requesting a loan of $45,000 with a structured repayment plan and legal documentation. The letter outlined their assets, their income projections, and their proposed payment schedule. It was everything Dad had promised on the phone, professional, businesslike, with proper interest rates and collateral agreements. They were offering to put Mom's car up as security, along with some equipment from the business. The attorney had even included character references and a detailed explanation of how the loan would save not just their home, but Dad's business and the 3 employees who depended on it. I had to admire the thoroughness of it. They'd clearly spent money they didn't have on legal fees to make their request as compelling as possible. The desperation was evident in every carefully worded paragraph. I called the attorney and declined their proposal. When he asked if there were different terms I'd consider, I told him there weren't. When he pressed for an explanation, I said simply that I wasn't in the business of making family loans. 2 days later, I drove past their house on my way to a client meeting. There was a foreclosure notice stapled to their front door, and Dad's work truck was gone from the driveway. The flower beds Mom had tended for 20 years were overgrown with weeds. I felt a twinge of something, not quite regret, but a recognition of how completely our family had fractured. These were the people who'd taught me to ride a bike and helped me with homework. They'd cheered at my Little League games and worried when I was sick. But they were also the people who'd taught me that love was conditional, that family loyalty flowed in only one direction. I kept driving. The house sold 3 weeks later to an investor who planned to flip it. My parents moved into a small rental apartment across town, and Dad took a job with one of his former competitors. Mom went back to work at a different dental office, her previous employer having filled her position during the crisis. My sister stopped speaking to me entirely. She blocked my number and unfriended me on social media. At family gatherings, the few I still attended, she acted like I didn't exist. Her children, my nieces, were told I was too busy with work to visit anymore. The rest of the extended family slowly chose sides. Some understood my position, admitting privately that they'd always thought using my college fund was wrong. Others maintained that families should forgive and forget, that I was punishing everyone for one mistake. I found myself oddly at peace with the divisions. For the first time in years, my relationships felt honest. The people who remained in my life accepted my choices without trying to guilt me into changing them. The ones who'd cut me off had shown their true priorities, and I was surprisingly okay with their absence. Final update. It's been 18 months since that first phone call, and the dust has mostly settled. My parents are surviving in their new circumstances, though Dad looks older every time I see him. Mom has stopped trying to guilt me into feeling bad about my decision, though she hasn't stopped hoping I'll change my mind. I've built a life that doesn't depend on their approval or understanding. I'm seeing someone now, a teacher who comes from a family that actually supports each other's dreams instead of sacrificing them for Instagram-worthy celebrations. She knows the whole story and has never once suggested I should have handled things differently. My career continues to thrive. I was promoted to senior partner last month, and I've started my own investment portfolio. I'm on track to retire comfortably in my 50s, assuming no one decides to raid my accounts for their dream vacations or second weddings. I think about my sisters sometimes, especially when I see wedding photos on social media from friends who manage to celebrate without bankrupting their families. Her marriage seems happy enough, though I wouldn't know for sure since we don't speak. Her daughters are growing up beautiful and hopefully learning that some dreams are worth saving for and others are worth reconsidering. Dad's business never recovered, but he seems to have found some peace in working for someone else. No more sleepless nights worrying about payroll or equipment failures. Mom has made friends at her new job and seems lighter somehow, freed from the stress of trying to hold together a failing company. I don't hate them. That's what people don't understand when they hear this story. I don't hate my parents or my sister. I simply learned to prioritize my own future the same way they prioritized theirs. They taught me that when resources are limited, you save the people and dreams that matter most to you. They just never expected me to learn the lesson so well. The bitter irony is that I could easily afford to help them now. $45,000 wouldn't significantly impact my financial situation. I could write that check today and never notice the money was gone. But writing the check would send a message I'm not willing to send, that their decision was ultimately consequence-free. That family means being the backup plan for other people's poor choices. Some people call it revenge. I call it consistency. They taught me that family members should be willing to sacrifice for each other's happiness. They just assumed they'd be the ones defining whose happiness mattered most. I'm 30 years old now, successful and genuinely content with my life. I have a retirement fund that no one can touch, an emergency account that exists only for my emergencies, and a clear understanding of what family actually means. It's not about blood or shared history or unconditional forgiveness. It's about showing up for each other when it matters, protecting each other's dreams instead of sacrificing them, and understanding that love without respect is just manipulation with better marketing. My family used my college fund to pay for my sister's wedding because they thought they could. They thought I'd forgive them, help them, and move forward like nothing had happened. They thought family meant I'd always be there to clean up their mistakes. They were wrong. But they taught me something valuable. When someone shows you their priorities, believe them the first time. I just wish it hadn't taken me 4 years and a foreclosure notice to fully understand the lesson. If you'd like to see more stories like this, a gentle tap on the subscribe button would mean the world to us. Please subscribe.